The air in the Langston estate felt still. Too still. Selina Monroe stood by the kitchen window, watching the sun set over the vineyards, her hands trembling with the weight of a secret she'd sworn never to reveal. She had promised Cecilia Langston, the late matriarch of the family, that she would protect Amara Cecilia's only daughter. Now, standing in this vast kitchen, Selina realized the promise she'd made was much more complicated than she had anticipated. The last time she stood here, it was Cecilia, the woman who had become a friend, who had poured tea and shared quiet, intimate moments in this very space. Their conversations often turned toward Amara's future. Cecilia had always seen something in Selina, a strength, a steadiness that she thought could safeguard the future of her child. But now, after Cecilia's sudden passing, Selina felt the weight of that promise pulling her down. The estate, a sprawling mansion with its century-old walls and polished wood floors, was silent in its usual way. The quiet hum of the kitchen, punctuated only by the soft clinking of silverware, felt like a backdrop to the growing tension that was filling the space. But the tension was not just in the walls. It was in Selina's chest, heavy and persistent. She had always kept her feelings tucked away, her mind focused on what needed to be done. But now, the weight of the truth she had yet to reveal, was nearly unbearable. Selina's fingers tightened around the porcelain cup in her hand as she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't want to think about it, didn't want to question the choices she had made in her life, but the truth she had kept hidden for so long was slipping through the cracks. The will, the guardianship arrangement, it was all a tightrope, one that had been delicately walked, balanced by trust and fragile promises. Her quiet reflection was interrupted when the heavy wooden door creaked open, and Victor Langston stepped inside. The tall, broad-shouldered man moved with the careful poise of someone who had spent years holding his composure in check. His dark eyes locked onto hers, and in that brief glance, Selina felt the tension between them, the unspoken understanding that lingered in the air. "Selina," Victor said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We need to talk." He stepped toward the counter, and Selina didn't move. She had known this moment would come, but she had never been prepared for it. Victor Langston had always been a man of action, but there was something in his gaze now that was different, something uncertain, something vulnerable. "About?" Selina asked, her voice steady but her pulse quickening. "About Amara," Victor said, lowering his voice as though the walls might be listening. He paused, eyes glancing briefly out the window at the vast vineyard beyond. The sun was just beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the estate. "About her future?" Selina swallowed, her throat dry, as the silence between them grew thick. The future had always seemed a distant, abstract thing. She had cared for Amara for years, helped her mother through the illness that had taken her. But now, the child she had come to see as her own was at the center of a battle she had never anticipated. "You've read the will," Victor continued, his gaze never leaving her. Selina's chest tightened. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor nodded, his jaw tightening as he looked down at his hands. "I'm not sure I can follow through with it, Selina," he said, his voice low. I can't be the father she needs. Not alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. The will had stipulated that Selina, not as a caretaker but as Amara's co-guardian, would help Victor raise the child, a role that had been unimaginable to her when she first agreed to it. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this," Victor said, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "I've never been good at these things, at being a family." Selina's heart ached as she looked at him, standing there, so broken and vulnerable. She had always seen him as strong, capable, even untouchable. But now she saw the weight of his grief and guilt pressing on his shoulders. And it was the same grief and guilt that had haunted her for so many years. "I'm not Cecilia," he added quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I can't promise you that I'll be what Amara needs." Selina felt her throat tighten. Cecilia. The woman who had trusted her with her daughter. The woman who had believed in her when no one else had. It was Cecilia who had made this choice, who had seen something in Selina that even she hadn't known was there. It was Cecilia who had believed in family, in legacy, even when the world around them was falling apart. "Victor," Selina said softly, her voice shaking with the weight of the years that had passed since they first met. "You don't have to be anyone else. Just be her father." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had come before, and everything that was yet to come. A long silence passed between them, broken only by the distant sound of a door creaking open. Victor looked down at his hands, fingers tight around the edges of the paper that had brought them to this point. Finally he sighed, his shoulders dropping as if the weight of the world had been lifted, if only for a moment. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Selina felt the heat rise in her chest, the weight of everything Cecilia's death, the guardianship, the unspoken feelings between them had built up, and she could feel herself on the edge of breaking. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, stepping forward. Her voice cracked with emotion, but she held her ground. "You have me." Victor met her gaze, the first real connection they had shared in years. "I know," he whispered. But just as the tension between them seemed to dissolve, the phone on the counter rang. Selina turned, startled by the sudden intrusion. The call was from an unknown number, but it felt like something she couldn't ignore. "I'll take care of this," she said softly, turning toward the door. Victor nodded, but his eyes lingered on her as she walked away. Selina felt the weight of everything the promise she had made to Cecilia, the choices that lay ahead, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was only just beginning. The phone's incessant ringing cut through the silence like a shard of glass. Selina's fingers brushed against the receiver before she hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. She had known that something was coming, something inevitable that would change everything. But this call was different. With a deep breath, she lifted the phone to her ear, steadying herself. "Hello?" There was a long pause before the voice on the other end spoke, low and urgent. "Selina Monroe?" Her stomach dropped. It was a voice she didn't recognize, yet it sounded too familiar, like a warning she had been ignoring. "Yes," she replied, her voice strained. "Who's calling?" The voice hesitated for a beat before continuing, colder now, more commanding. "You don't know me, but you need to listen carefully. I have information that will change the way you see the Langston family. It's about the will, about the legacy they want to hide." Selina's breath hitched. The will. She'd known there was something off about the way things were being handled, the secrecy, the guarded conversations in darkened hallways, the hidden glances. But this felt like the tipping point. "I don't know who you are," Selina said, her voice shaky with the weight of what was unfolding. "And I don't know what you want, but—" "I'm not here to hurt you," the voice interrupted, its tone softening just a fraction. "I'm here to help. But you need to be prepared. The truth is more dangerous than you think." Before Selina could respond, the line went dead. She stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, staring out the kitchen window as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains. The vineyards, once so full of life, now seemed desolate, just rows upon rows of empty promise. What did this stranger know? And why had they chosen now, of all times, to speak up? As the last remnants of daylight disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was just beneath the surface of everything she thought she understood. Victor Langston sat in the study, the weight of his past pressing down on his shoulders like an anchor. His hands were folded on the desk before him, the sleek black leather of the chair beneath him feeling more like a prison than a seat of power. The world outside was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time in a long while, Victor found himself questioning everything. The phone call earlier that day had unsettled him. He had tried to keep his emotions in check, to remain the strong, capable patriarch of the Langston family. But the truth, the gnawing truth, kept clawing at him. He thought about his daughter, Amara, tucked safely in her room upstairs. The guilt of failing her, of failing his wife, Cecilia, weighed heavily on him. He had promised them both that he would protect their legacy, their future. But now, standing in the echo of his mistakes, he wasn't so sure he could keep that promise. The door creaked open behind him, and Selina entered. The usual warmth in her gaze had been replaced by something colder, something more guarded. Her presence in the room seemed like a subtle warning, an unspoken acknowledgement that the quiet comfort they had shared was about to change. "Selina," Victor said, lifting his gaze to meet hers, "is everything all right?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crossed the room, standing by the window, looking out over the vineyard that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. "Someone called me," she said, her voice a whisper. "Someone with information about the will." Victor's heart skipped a beat. The will. That document, the one that had always felt like the ticking time bomb in the back of his mind, was finally threatening to detonate. He had done everything he could to protect Amara, to shield her from the chaos he knew was lurking. But now, it felt like the walls were closing in on him. "I thought we were done with this," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I thought we had everything under control." "We don't," Selina replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know who it was, but they knew things about the legacy, about the things we've kept hidden." Victor stood, his mind racing. "What do they want?" "I don't know. They said they wanted to help. But there's something off about this, something I can't ignore." Selina's eyes were dark, her thoughts heavy with the burden of what she had just learned. She could feel the truth creeping in, slowly suffocating the walls of the life she'd spent so long building. This wasn't just about protecting the Langston family anymore. This was about saving themselves from a truth they weren't prepared to face. There was a long pause, the only sound in the room the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Victor didn't speak, but his mind was already turning over the possibilities, the implications of this unexpected revelation. There was no telling who this mysterious caller was, or what they might know. "We need to find out who this is," Selina said, breaking the silence. "We need to know who's behind this." Victor nodded, his expression hardening. "I'll handle it. But you—" "No," she interrupted, her tone sharper than he expected. "This is bigger than you think. We need to confront this together." For the first time in a long while, Victor didn't argue. He simply nodded. The clock continued its slow ticking in the background as the tension between them built, thick and unyielding. Victor had spent years building this empire, one brick at a time. But now, it felt like the foundation was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "I need to know everything," Victor said softly, his eyes meeting Selina's. "I need to know who's behind this." "I'll find out," Selina replied, her voice steady but with a quiet determination that he hadn't heard from her before. "I'll do whatever it takes." The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time, and Selina's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the sound itself was dragging her back into a past she had tried so desperately to bury. The weight of it all was too much to ignore. Now this was no longer a quiet family matter. The phone call, the mysterious letter, the secrets lingering beneath the surface, it was all culminating in this moment. The door, once a simple threshold to safety, now felt like the gateway to everything that was about to unravel. Victor looked up sharply, his brow furrowed with concern. He had known this day would come, but even his stoic nature couldn't prepare him for the flood of emotions that had begun to take over. This was not just about family secrets anymore. It was about survival. Selina's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk as she stood frozen for a moment. "Who would be here at this hour?" she asked, the question almost rhetorical, though she already had a sinking suspicion. Victor didn't answer immediately. He simply moved toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. When he opened it, the sight before him was nothing like what he had expected. Standing in the doorway, drenched from the rain, was a familiar face, from the past Reginald Blackwell. His presence felt like a shadow, looming larger than ever before. Reginald, the former estate manager. The man whose sudden departure years ago had been shrouded in mystery. The man who, just moments ago, had seemed like a distant, fading memory, was now standing on the doorstep, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and determination. Victor's breath caught in his throat. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp, a mixture of surprise and caution. Reginald stood there for a moment, not stepping forward, as if waiting for something, perhaps permission, perhaps an invitation. When he spoke, his voice was low, the words heavy with meaning. "I need to talk," Reginald said, his eyes scanning the room, landing briefly on Selina before flicking back to Victor. "It's about your daughter, Amara." The name hung in the air like an unspoken curse. Amara, the reason they were all here, the reason they were caught in this tangled web of secrets, betrayals, and promises. Victor and Selina exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes without uttering a word. "Come in," Victor finally said, stepping aside. He couldn't afford to ignore this. Reginald knew too much. The secrets he carried could shatter everything they had worked so hard to protect. But even more pressing was the revelation he seemed to be bringing with him. The three of them sat in the living room, the fireplace crackling softly, casting a dim, flickering light across the room. The rain continued to beat against the windows, a constant reminder of the storm outside, and perhaps the one brewing within. "I've been trying to stay away," Reginald began, his voice laced with tension. "But I can't anymore. There's too much at stake." Victor, his hands folded tightly in his lap, didn't respond immediately. Selina sat opposite Reginald, her expression unreadable, but the pulse of anxiety beneath her skin was undeniable. This wasn't just about the legacy anymore. This was about Amara's safety. And if Reginald had information, it could mean the difference between keeping their family intact or watching it crumble. "I don't understand," Victor said, his voice rough with barely controlled frustration. "Why are you here now, after all this time?" Reginald's eyes flickered with something guilt, maybe regret. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, as if the truth he was about to reveal weighed too heavily on him. "It's about what happened to your wife," he said quietly. "And what happened to Amara." The words hung in the air like a threat, and for a moment, neither Victor nor Selina could speak. The mention of Cecilia's death still felt like a raw wound, a wound they weren't sure would ever heal. Reginald knew more than he was letting on. "What do you know?" Selina asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Reginald hesitated, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "I was the one who found the letter," he admitted, his eyes shifting between Selina and Victor. "The one your wife, Cecilia, had hidden." Victor's breath caught, his eyes narrowing. "What letter?" Reginald took a deep breath. "The one about Amara's future. The one that could tear the family apart." Victor's mind raced, but he couldn't grasp the full scope of what Reginald was implying. What had Cecilia hidden? And why had it taken this long for anyone to speak of it? The silence that followed felt suffocating, and Selina could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. "The will," Reginald continued, his voice now quieter, as though he were afraid to speak too loudly. "Cecilia's final wishes weren't what you think. She didn't want Amara to inherit everything, not the way you believe. There were conditions you don't even know about." Selina leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "What conditions?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but filled with a desperate urgency. Reginald looked around the room as if expecting someone to appear, to stop him from revealing the truth. "There was a clause," he said slowly. "A clause that stated that if anything happened to her, Amara would be taken away from you, from the family, and someone would take control of her future." Victor's stomach turned. Who? Who would take control?" "I don't know yet," Reginald admitted, his voice shaking slightly. "But it's not over. Someone you know has been manipulating everything from the shadows." The words hit Victor like a punch to the gut. Reginald's admission, the realization that someone close to them had been pulling the strings all along, sent a shiver down his spine. "I didn't come here to destroy you," Reginald said, his voice filled with regret. "But you need to know, Amara's future isn't as secure as you think, and the truth behind what happened to Cecilia." He trailed off, shaking his head, as though the weight of the information was too much for him to bear. Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Enough. You don't get to drop this on me and walk away, not after everything." Reginald stood too, his face pale, his eyes wide with the fear that had once ruled him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I had no choice. You need to be prepared for what's coming." Before Victor could respond, there was a knock at the door, sharp, insistent. It wasn't the kind of knock that was made by a visitor, but the kind that was made by someone who needed something. Something important. Something urgent. Victor turned toward the door, his expression darkening. The knock echoed again, louder this time, sharp and insistent. Selina's heart raced, every muscle in her body tensing as if bracing for impact. It wasn't the kind of knock that could be ignored, it demanded attention, the kind that made every nerve in her body stand on edge. This wasn't a simple visitor or a familiar face. This was something more, something that might shatter the fragile peace they had left. Victor turned sharply toward the door, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. He had already known, deep down, that things couldn't stay calm forever. But now, standing at the threshold of this new threat, he had no idea who was on the other side or what they had come to say. He glanced at Selina, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met silent understanding passing between them, a shared recognition that their world had irrevocably shifted. Reginald stood in the corner, visibly uncomfortable, as if the very air around him had thickened. His eyes flickered from the door to Victor, then to Selina. "I don't know what's happening here," he murmured, his voice almost inaudible. Victor, however, wasn't in the mood for hesitation. He stalked toward the door, his hand gripping the doorknob with a force that made his knuckles white. He swung it open without ceremony, revealing a tall figure standing just beyond the threshold, a man cloaked in a dark trench coat, the rain still dripping from the edges of his hat. Victor's breath caught in his throat. The man before him was unfamiliar, but there was something about his presence, something cold, that made the air around them grow thicker. He had the air of someone who had seen too much, someone who had walked through fire and come out on the other side with secrets that burned his soul. "Can I help you?" Victor asked, his voice firm, although there was a subtle tremor in his tone. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Reginald before settling on Selina. His gaze lingered, as though he were weighing her presence, trying to determine how much she knew. "Mr. Langston," the man finally spoke, his voice low and smooth, as if every word was carefully measured. "I'm here on behalf of someone you know, someone who thinks you're not prepared for what's coming." Victor's mind raced. He had already been dragged into the web of uncertainty, and now the words of this stranger seemed like the last thing he needed. But there was no turning back. "Who are you?" Selina asked, her voice sharp with caution. "I'm here to deliver a message," the man said, his eyes never leaving her. "And it's not a message you can ignore." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence immediately filling the room. His trench coat rustled as he moved, his gaze flickering over Victor, then over to Reginald, who looked as though he were about to bolt from the room. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken secrets that seemed to weave their way around every word. Victor crossed his arms, standing his ground. "Who's the message from?" The man hesitated for a moment before finally answering, his voice low and deliberate. "It's from someone you once trusted, someone who believes the Langston legacy is in grave danger." Selina's pulse quickened. The mention of the legacy sent a sharp pang through her chest, as if the very foundation of everything they had built was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Her thoughts raced. Who could it be? Who had the power to threaten the legacy, the family, and everything they had worked so hard to preserve? "I don't have time for games," Victor snapped, his voice tense. "Get to the point." The man's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You need to know that the will wasn't the only thing Cecilia left behind." At the mention of Cecilia's name, Victor stiffened. There was no one else in this world who had meant more to him than his late wife, but the past, with its lies and betrayals, had a way of creeping back in. "What do you mean?" Selina's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. The man pulled a small envelope from inside his coat and slid it across the table, the thick parchment paper catching the dim light from the chandelier. "Cecilia knew everything was about to fall apart. She left instructions, but they're not what you think." Victor glanced down at the envelope. His breath caught in his throat. Every instinct in his body told him to open it, but a part of him was terrified of what it might reveal. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, suffocating him with its truth. Reginald stepped forward, his voice shaky. "What are you saying? What's in the envelope?" The man looked at Reginald with a knowing glance before turning back to Victor. "I'm not here to explain everything, Langston. I'm just the messenger. The truth is coming, whether you're ready for it or not." Victor's hand trembled as he picked up the envelope, his fingers brushing the edge of the paper. He could feel the cold weight of the secret it contained, and in that moment he realized just how little control he had left. "I don't trust you," Victor said quietly, his voice strained with frustration and fear. "You're not telling me everything. Who are you really working for?" The man's gaze darkened, and for a moment he didn't speak. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, stretching out between them, thick with the anticipation of what was to come. Finally he turned and spoke, his words laced with something darker, more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. I'm working for someone who wants to make sure the Langston family doesn't fall apart. He paused, locking eyes with Victor. But if you're not careful, it might. Before anyone could respond, the man turned and left, the sound of his footsteps fading into the night, leaving behind nothing but the weight of his words and the lingering scent of rain. Victor stood frozen in place, staring at the envelope in his hands, the message it contained now hanging over him like a cloud ready to burst. The sun had long set, casting the estate into shadows, the towering trees outside creating a labyrinth of shapes against the walls. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that made every footstep sound like a drumbeat. Victor sat in his study, his eyes fixed on the papers in front of him. Cecilia's last words, the ones that had been left behind for him to decipher. He hadn't dared open the envelope yet, but now, with the weight of everything that had been said, he could no longer pretend he wasn't ready to face it. He reached for the envelope, the paper cool and thick under his fingers. The very act of holding it felt like a betrayal, as if opening it would unlock a door that could never be closed again. His breath was shallow as he slit the envelope open, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. The words on it were precise, almost too deliberate Cecilia's handwriting, the neat script that he had once adored, now a reminder of a woman who had known too much, too soon. Victor, if you are reading this, then I am no longer here to protect you. I have seen the cracks, the fissures in our life that have been growing, and I know the truth is far more dangerous than we ever imagined. Amara must be protected, Victor. She is the key to everything. The legacy you've built, the empire you've fought for, it all rests on her shoulders now. But you must listen carefully. There are forces out there that will stop at nothing to take it from her. The will was never just about money. It's about control. And those who want control will do anything to get it. You've been blind to the threat in front of you. The one closest to you, the one you trust. They are the ones who will destroy everything. Victor's heart thudded painfully against his ribs as he read the last lines again. He could feel the blood draining from his face, the icy grip of realization tightening around his chest. Who was Cecilia talking about? And what was this threat that had been hidden for so long? As he set the letter down, his hand shook. The only sound in the room was the distant ticking of the clock on the wall, as if time itself were counting down, waiting for the next move. He was so focused on the letter that he didn't hear Selina approach. She entered the room, her footsteps soft but sure, her presence cutting through the fog that had settled over him. "Victor," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "What's going on?" He looked up, his eyes wild with confusion and disbelief. "She knew," he muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. "She knew everything, Selina. She knew about the will, about Amara, about the danger, and about the person who's been pulling the strings." Selina stood frozen in the doorway, her breath catching as the weight of his words sank in. "What person?" she asked, her voice strained. Victor ran a hand through his hair, his mind a storm of thoughts and fears. "I don't know yet, but Cecilia was clear there's someone in our midst, someone close, someone we trust." The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in. The secrets, once buried so deeply, were rising to the surface, threatening to drown them both. Victor knew that nothing would ever be the same again. "I need to know who it is," Selina said, her tone quiet but resolute. "We need to find out before it's too late." Victor nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in like a stone in his stomach. He knew she was right. They had to uncover the truth before it tore them apart. The rain had started again, the soft patter of droplets against the windows creating a constant hum in the background. Selina watched Victor as he stared at the letter in his hands, his eyes distant, lost in thought. She could see the strain in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged under the burden of this revelation. "You've been keeping something from me," Selina said, her voice breaking the silence. "I can feel it. What haven't you told me, Victor?" Victor's eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment there was hesitation. But then, with a heavy sigh, he set the letter down and stood up, walking toward the window. He stared out at the vineyard, the rows of grapevines bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. "I've always protected Amara," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've protected this family from the outside world, from anyone who might try to take what's ours. But I've never considered the danger from within. Cecilia warned me, but I didn't listen." Selina stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Victor, we can't change the past, but we can control what happens next. You're not alone in this. We'll find out who's behind this together." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared burden settling between them. It was a burden they had never asked for, but one they could no longer escape. The truth was closer than they thought, and they both knew that the fight for their family's future was just beginning. The next morning, the estate was still. The heavy rain had finally stopped, but the air remained thick with anticipation. Selina stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapping around the warm mug of coffee as she gazed out at the property. The vineyard, once full of life, now seemed empty, almost as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Victor entered, his face a mask of determination. "I'm calling a meeting," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "We need to get ahead of this before it spirals any further." Selina nodded, her gaze steady. She could feel the tension in the air, the invisible thread that bound them together, pulling them toward something neither of them was fully prepared for. They walked out of the kitchen together, toward the living room where the rest of the family was waiting. Each step they took felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of their decisions was pressing down on them. They were about to confront the truth, but the question was who would be standing beside them when it all came to light. The room was thick with silence, a silence that felt almost suffocating. Victor had just entered the living room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around the table. The family, already seated, looked up at him expectantly, each one feeling the weight of the moment. But it wasn't just the family that was waiting. It was the storm of truth that was about to crash down on them all. They could feel it hanging in the air like a promise, and no one knew who would survive its impact. The door had slammed open with a suddenness that had echoed down the hallway, a signal that someone was about to step into the fray, someone who had the power to change everything. For a moment, Victor hesitated, his hand still on the doorknob, his mind reeling from the conversation with Reginald just hours earlier. But the knock on the door, the letter he had yet to fully decipher, and now this, his thoughts felt scattered, unraveling like a thread being pulled loose. "Who is it?" Selina's voice was steady but tinged with fear. They all felt it, the danger closing in. Victor turned back toward the entrance, and there stood a figure in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hall. The person stood still, their face obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the cold determination in their posture. "We need to talk. Now." It was Julian, the family's longtime lawyer, the man who had been in charge of all the legal matters for the Langston estate, whose face had always been a fixture in their lives, the one who had handled the will. His voice, however, lacked its usual calm assurance, and his eyes wide with something darker than concern made it clear that this wasn't a casual visit. This was urgent. Julian stepped inside without waiting for a reply, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor as he walked directly to the center of the room. He looked at each of them in turn, pausing briefly at Victor, his eyes full of hesitation. "Something's happened," Julian said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that felt foreign. "The will, it's been compromised. I need your attention, all of you." Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this, though he couldn't quite explain why. Something deep within him had known that the secrets they had tried to bury would eventually come crawling back, dragging the past out of its hiding places. And now, with Julian standing in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder if they had already lost the battle before it even began. "What are you talking about?" Selena's voice was cold, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. Julian swallowed hard, then placed a thick folder on the coffee table. It was unmistakable, its contents clearly visible, spilling over with legal documents. The weight of it all seemed to hang heavily in the air, as though it carried the burden of everything they had been running from. "This isn't just about Cecilia's will anymore," Julian continued, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something you need to know about what's been happening, something far more dangerous than you can imagine." Victor's gaze flickered to the folder, then back to Julian, his pulse quickening with each passing second. He had heard whispers of a conspiracy, of hidden agendas, but hearing it now, spoken aloud, made it all too real. This wasn't just about the estate, or the inheritance. This was about something more insidious, something that had been creeping in the shadows for far too long. "What do you mean?" Victor asked, his voice tense. Julian looked around the room, his eyes darting between the family members, as though weighing whether or not to reveal everything. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke again. "It's about Amara," Julian said, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "The true nature of the will, the one you've never seen, was hidden from all of you. And there's someone in this room who has been playing a dangerous game with her future." A chill ran through the room as everyone turned to look at one another. Reginald shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes betraying a mix of guilt and fear. Selena's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles white with the strain. And Victor felt as if the ground beneath him had shifted, as if the very foundation of everything he knew was about to crumble. "Who?" Victor's voice cracked, the question heavy with urgency. He needed to know who had been pulling the strings, who had been orchestrating the chaos that now threatened to tear their family apart. Julian didn't answer right away. He reached for the folder, opening it carefully as though handling something fragile, something that might fall apart with the slightest touch. He pulled out a set of documents, his hands trembling slightly as he handed them to Victor. Victor's eyes scanned the papers, his heart sinking with every line he read. The names on the documents weren't what he had expected. They were familiar, but they carried a weight he hadn't anticipated. One name stood out above the rest, a name that made Victor's blood run cold. "Reginald Blackwell," Victor said, his voice barely a whisper, as though the name itself was too much to bear. Reginald's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing as though trying to find the words that would explain everything. But no words came. There was nothing to say. The truth was right there in front of them, and all they could do was stare at it in disbelief. "What is this?" Selena asked, her voice shaking as she reached for the papers, her fingers trembling. Julian stepped forward, his voice grave. "Reginald has been manipulating the will from the start. He's the one who's been hiding the truth, pulling strings behind the scenes. And he's been working with someone else, someone you thought was on your side." Victor felt his world shift. Everything he had believed, everything he had trusted, was now in question. Reginald, the man he had once relied on, was the very one who had been plotting against him, against their family. The weight of the betrayal hit Victor like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. Reginald stood up, his face a mixture of regret and fear. "I didn't want this, Victor. I never wanted it to go this far. But I was afraid of what might happen if the truth came out." Victor shook his head, unable to process the magnitude of what Reginald had just confessed. "You're telling me you've been lying to me all this time? That you've been manipulating Amara's future?" Reginald's eyes flickered with guilt, but he didn't answer. Selina turned to Julian, her voice now a low growl. "What do you mean, working with someone else? Who else is involved?" Julian hesitated before answering, his eyes flickering toward Reginald. "The other person is much closer than you think, and they've been hiding in plain sight." In the end, the Langston family was no longer the same. The secrets that had once been buried in the shadows, hidden beneath layers of pride, ambition, and unspoken fear, were now exposed for all to see. The legacy that had once seemed unshakable had cracked open, revealing the fissures and fractures beneath its polished exterior. And with every revelation, the family, bound by blood and by the weight of generations, had to come to terms with something far more painful than any loss of wealth or status, the truth about themselves. Victor, the once unshakable patriarch, had never imagined that the price of his empire would be the very foundation of his family. His life had been built on the belief that control, wealth, and legacy were the pillars that would sustain him, that would hold everything together. But in the end, those pillars had crumbled, and he was left standing in the rubble, forced to reckon with the choices he had made and the lives he had shaped along the way. Selina, too, had her own journey to navigate. She had always believed in the strength of their family, in the power of their shared history. But with the truth coming to light, she found herself questioning everything she had ever known about loyalty, trust, and what it meant to truly belong. The weight of the past bore down on her, but as she stood beside Victor, as they both faced the consequences of their actions, she realized that some things, some bonds couldn't be destroyed, no matter how broken they seemed. Amara, caught in the midst of the storm, had been left to inherit not only the family name, but the legacy of deceit and betrayal that had haunted her parents. She had longed for answers, for a glimpse of the truth that had been hidden from her, and now, with everything laid bare, she had to decide what kind of future she would build. Would she follow in the footsteps of those who had come before her, or would she carve her own path, one forged from the ashes of the past? Reginald, the once trusted confidant, had been revealed as a man consumed by fear, fear of losing control, of being left behind, of not being enough. The weight of his betrayal hung heavily over him, and yet, even as he stood in the shadows of his own guilt, there was a part of him that longed for redemption. Would he find a way to redeem himself, to reconcile the fractured relationships he had destroyed? Or would he be forever marked by the choices he had made? The story of the Langston family is not one of clean resolutions or neatly tied endings. It is a story of people flawed, imperfect, and deeply human who have to face the consequences of their actions and the truth they've spent so long running from. It's a story of love, betrayal, and the painful but necessary act of forgiving not just others, but oneself. It's a story of legacy, yes, but also of change, of growth, and of the ability to rebuild something stronger and more enduring from the rubble of the past. In the end, the family learned that legacy is not just about what we inherit, but about what we choose to pass on. It is not defined by wealth or power, but by the relationships we build, the truths we are willing to confront, and the forgiveness we are able to offer. The pain of facing the truth is not easy, but it is through that pain that the seeds of redemption are sown. The philosophy remains: the past cannot be undone, but it is what we do with the truth in the present that defines us. If you found yourself moved by this story, please leave a 1 in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear the next story as the journey of healing and redemption continues.